It was nearly 2 in the morning. A muffled, insistent ring tore Ellie Hayes from her deep sleep, like a rough shove to the ribs. She jolted in the bed, and her hand clawed helplessly across the nightstand, sweeping aside a digital clock and a glass of water. In the dark of the small apartment, which now served as both her bedroom and living area after the kids had moved out, the sound felt aggressively loud, excessive. Who could be calling at this hour? It had to be something terrible. Ellie finally fumbled for the phone. The screen burned her retina with a bright white light. It was an unfamiliar number. She swallowed, feeling her mouth go instantly dry, accepted the call, and brought the device to her ear without saying a word. From the other end came a dry, emotionless male voice that cut straight to the chase, wasting no time on pleasantries. "Mrs. Hayes, you are listed as the emergency contact for Sylvia Marshall. Our condolences. Acute cardiac failure. Death occurred around 10 o'clock this evening." The toneless words echoed in the silence of the room like crystal shattering on tile. Ellie's heart, which had been wildly pounding only a second ago from the sudden awakening, suddenly stilled. It felt like it had turned into a heavy, cold stone in her chest, crushing and motionless. She pressed herself against the wall, feeling the cold drywall through her thin nightgown, digging into her shoulder blades. "No," was the only thing she managed to breathe out. A spasm seized her throat. Ellie and Sylvia had been friends for 30 years, starting from their first semester in college, through marriages, divorces, the births, and the raising of their children. They were those rare people who didn't need to explain their jokes or justify a silence. They simply existed together. Sylvia, with her perpetual enthusiasm and her habit of leaving 20% of her planner pages blank for new adventures, had always seemed unsinkable. They had recently been discussing planning a cruise to the Caribbean, and now, a heart attack. Ellie slowly slid to the floor. Images spun in her head, which felt stuffed with heavy cotton wool. Sylvia laughing at a failed cake. Sylvia helping Ellie pack boxes during a move. Sylvia holding her cat, Maisie, pressed against her chest as if she were the most precious furry bundle in the world. Ellie's invitation to the funeral was stiff and formal. Sylvia's sister, Audrey, a relative her friend barely spoke to while alive, had taken over all the arrangements. It was a cold, unfamiliar ceremony. The viewing room was paneled in dark, polished wood. The scent of frankincense, trying to cut through the stuffy, official air, was layered over the sickly sweet aroma of cheap carnations. Ellie stood near the casket, feeling the tension tighten the skin at her temples. She wasn't crying. She couldn't. Her tears seemed to have frozen into ice, locking her eye sockets. She just stared at her friend's face, so remote, so unlike the lively, mischievous Sylvie she knew. Nearby, a little ways off, Audrey and her husband Charles were talking quietly. They were the kind of relatives who only appear at weddings and funerals to assess the scale of the inheritance. "Thank God all the formalities are done quickly," Audrey said curtly, adjusting her black scarf. "Now the main thing is to sell the condo. The prices are good right now." Charles nodded in agreement. His gaze slid across the walls. "What about the pet?" he asked softly, but Ellie was standing too close. "There was a cat, a ginger one, I think." Audrey dismissively shifted her shoulder. "Maisie? Yeah, we don't need her. Lena's allergic, and I can't stand that hair everywhere." Ellie felt a chill run down her spine, even though the room was warm. Her heart started beating again, not from grief, but from a growing, sharp fury. "And what are we supposed to do with her anyway?" Audrey continued, lowering her tone, but not enough for Ellie to stop hearing. "She's too attached. The simplest thing is to drop her off somewhere far away, in the country, or straight to a shelter." Charles shrugged. "She'd get lost immediately in the country. She's strictly an indoor cat. Well, just take her somewhere. The main thing is to make sure she's not in the way." At that moment, the anger Ellie had been holding back since the phone call burst forth, transforming into a pure, uncontrolled determination. They were talking about Maisie, the only creature truly dear to Sylvia, as if she were an old, worn-out chair. They were planning to simply discard a part of her life, a piece of her heart, for the convenience of selling the condo. Ellie turned around. Her steps on the marble floor of the hall were sharp, almost chopping. She felt her feet strike the cold stone, and that physical impact seemed to be her only connection to reality. She walked up to Audrey and Charles. "Maisie? I'm taking Maisie," Ellie said. Audrey raised her light, indifferent eyebrows, sizing her up from head to toe as if Ellie were a beggar who had walked in off the street. "Why would you? It's just a cat. She's old. She's temperamental." "Sylvia wouldn't want you to take her anywhere." Ellie's voice was surprisingly firm, without a tremor. It wasn't a request. It was a statement. Charles, seeing the resolution in her eyes, hurried to diffuse the situation, trying to appear noble. "Well, if you're willing to take on this burden, Mrs. Hayes, we're all for it. Less hassle for us. Audrey has the key. We'd be happy." Audrey indifferently pulled the key to Sylvia's apartment out of her small purse and handed it to Ellie. Relief was written all over her face. The cat, minus one problem. An hour later, Ellie stood at the familiar door. Sylvia's apartment smelled of her perfume, dust, and an inexplicable, frightening emptiness. In the living room, a dark blue plastic carrier stood beneath the window. Hearing footsteps, the cat emerged from the corner. Ginger, with thick but slightly matted fur and a wide, displeased forehead. Maisie. She didn't rush to Ellie in greeting, nor did she make a sound. She simply stopped a few feet away and stared at the newcomer with enormous amber eyes. There was no fear in them. There was icy, absolute emptiness. Ellie knelt down. "Hi, girl. We've both been betrayed, haven't we?" Maisie turned away and silently, like a shadow, slipped under the sofa. Ellie cautiously picked up the carrier. Inside was a clean, warm blanket and Sylvia's familiar scent. Ellie opened the door and waited. The cat wouldn't come out. She had to pull her out by force, wrapping her in that very blanket. Maisie hissed, a short, vicious sound, and then immediately fell silent once she was inside the container. Locking Sylvia's door, Ellie felt the weight of the carrier in her hand. It was a physical, palpable burden. The whole drive back, the cat never once meowed. She only once scraped her claws against the plastic. This was not the weight of memory. This was the start of something unknown, alarming, and perhaps too heavy for her shoulders. Ellie only just realized she hadn't just taken a cat. She had let a stranger's wounded grief into her life, and now they were both in the dark. "Are you sure you thought this through?" George's voice on the phone was laced with sharp disbelief, as if she were doubting not Ellie's sanity, but the very fact of her existence. "Maisie was never sociable, you know that. Sylvie spoiled her rotten." "What was I supposed to do?" Ellie pressed her shoulder against the phone, trying to wipe up the tea she'd spilled on the kitchen counter with one hand. She felt exhausted, as if she'd been working for hours. Those relatives were just going to throw her out, straight to a shelter, or worse, out in the country. Well, at least at a shelter they'd find her new owners who know what to do with animals. Georgia snorted. "You at your age, Lena. What are you signing up for? This isn't a plush kitten. This is a fully grown, difficult, and cranky animal." "She's hidden behind the armoire and won't come out," Ellie said wearily. "Cranky? She seems to be in shock, just like I am. Shock won't feed you, honey. Think clearly." Georgia lowered her voice to a cautionary whisper. "It's better to find her a good home before she ruins all your furniture, and before you start spending money on vets. It's just a cat." Ellie placed the phone back on its base. The sound of Georgia's voice, full of pragmatic rigidity, only intensified her inner irritation. She turned toward the massive, imposing antique armoire in the hallway, made of dark, lacquered wood, which had stood there since she moved in. That's where Maisie had found her perfect refuge, in the narrow, dusty gap between the armoire and the wall. Since Ellie brought her here 3 days ago, the cat hadn't come out. She hadn't touched the water, hadn't eaten the tuna pâté that Sylvia always bought, and certainly hadn't used the new litter box. The apartment, usually quiet and flooded with warm light from the panoramic window, felt cold. A heavy, suffocating odor now hung in the air, a mix of fear, stale air, and what seemed like old, forgotten cardboard. Every time Ellie walked into the hall, she felt a wave of alien, hostile presence wash over her. Ellie sat on the floor, feeling the cold linoleum penetrate her thin house pants, unpleasantly chilling the skin on her hips. "Now, Maisie," she said softly, trying to make her voice sound as neutral and calm as possible. "You can't sit there forever. I need to at least clean the hall." No sound. Only 2 narrow, gleaming amber lights flashed in the darkness under the armoire and immediately vanished the moment Ellie shifted. She tried cautiously, slowly, to move the food bowl closer to the hiding spot. The answer was a dry, loud hiss, amplified by the echo in the narrow space, immediately followed by a short, fast strike, like a gunshot. A claw drew a thin red line across the back of her hand. Blood beaded up in tiny droplets, and the scratch began to pulse with a sharp, burning sensation. Ellie yanked her hand back, feeling the sting fill with heat. The animal wasn't just defending itself, it was signaling complete rejection, a boundary that couldn't be crossed under any circumstances. This wasn't just a cat grieving its owner. It was a ball of fear and pain that saw Ellie not as a rescuer, but as a new jailer. It was a wall, and Maisie was an outsider in this house, like some kind of enemy agent. Chloe called that afternoon. Her tone, as always, was businesslike and demanding, devoid of unnecessary emotion. "How are you, Mom? You were supposed to rest after all that, and you brought home a cat. Why?" "I couldn't leave her, Chloe. You have to understand, she's the only thing left of Sylvie, besides the keys and old photos. It's an animal, and she doesn't belong to you," Chloe snapped. "Do you know how much trouble you'll have with vets if she's old, and you've seen her fur? You're on a fixed income, not a bank account." "But she's—" Chloe interrupted her, and there was impatience in that single word. "Not your baby. Let's be real. This was an impulsive, emotional decision. You're just making your life harder. Listen to me. I found Hope's Haven Animal Rescue online. I called. They take in adult cats. She'll be better off there than suffering in a corner. You can't do anything for her." With every word from her daughter, Ellie felt her last hope for understanding vanish. She wanted to yell, to assert her right, but in the end, she only felt a crushing, all-consuming weariness. Her back, tense since the funeral, ached intolerably, as if she were carrying a heavy, age-old sack of sand. She felt the full weight of the situation, the stranger's grief, the stranger's cat, and the indifference of those closest to her. She glanced at the red scratch on her hand. It wasn't just a wound, but a receipt for her crazy, reckless act. Why had she done it? To be a hero? To save a memory? Now all she felt was the desire to wash her hands of this blood and everything. Maybe Georgia was right. Maybe Chloe was right. It would be easier to give up. The fatigue was stronger than her resolve. Tomorrow she would call that shelter, find out the conditions, and put an end to it. Ellie looked toward the armoire. The gaps beneath it were black and impenetrable. She was alone. The cat was alone too. And now their solitude, instead of being shared, had multiplied, becoming twice as heavy. 3 days passed, and nothing changed. Attempts to feed, attempts to comfort, attempts to even just catch a glimpse. Everything shattered against a deaf wall of rejection. Ellie felt like she was the intruder in this house, an outsider who had come to take away the last link between the owner and the animal. If even her daughter and best friend didn't understand, then who and why was she doing all this? She closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would call Georgia and ask for the shelter's address. She had almost made the decision, but then Maisie stirred faintly behind the armoire, and Ellie, not knowing why, didn't dial the number, putting off the call until the next morning. She had to gather the strength for the decisive step that would forever end this voluntary torment. Hunger was a thin, prickly thread woven into the fear. Maisie lay deep, huddled under the armoire, where the dust and dry air enveloped her, creating a weak illusion of safety. A few days ago, the scent that represented the world, the rules, and the law had vanished. Her scent. Now, a strange, sharp, alarming aroma hung around, cut with a faint hint of musk and lavender. It was the scent of the other, a large, clumsy, constantly moving figure that tried to intrude, offer food, and break the sacred silence. The most frightening thing was the sound of the other's voice. It didn't have that familiar softness, that melody that Maisie could sleep curled up to. The other's voice was strained, choked, and worst of all, it constantly changed. Sometimes it sounded sickly sweet and false. Sometimes it became low and gravelly with sorrow or exhaustion. The cat felt the floor's vibrations, and they transmitted the movements of the other. Back and forth, a cold draft from the front door, the slight rustle of clothes, the shuffle of slippers. Outside, in this new world, there was not a single point of safety. Every surface, every shadow was hostile. Maisie didn't dare take a full breath, so as not to betray herself, so as not to attract attention. Beneath the dense fleece blanket that the other had pushed under with the bowl, there was still an elusive echo of the familiar scent, but even that was gradually fading, layered over the other's sharp, foreign traces. Her back, pressed against the rough wood of the armoire, tensed when she heard a new, unexpected sound, the squeaky, demanding trill of a phone ring. Ellie sat on the old, saggy sofa, hugging her arms around her chest. She called Natalie, a former colleague of Sylvia's, hoping to find at least a shred of sympathy. "Natalie, hi. Listen, I took Maisie, Sylvie's cat." Natalie, with her eternal enthusiasm and habit of talking too loud, immediately switched to a businesslike tone. "Oh, yeah. Well, good for you. The girls and I collected money for a wreath. Did you get it? The cat. Well, that's a problem, of course." "Yes, a problem," Ellie whispered, feeling despair well up in her chest. "She won't eat, won't drink. She just sits behind the armoire and hisses if I go near her." "Lena, come on. It's just a cat." Impatience crept into Natalie's voice. "An animal isn't a person. She'll get hungry. She'll come out. Or are you planning to fuss with her for 6 months now? Don't you have enough of your own problems? Your husband died 3 years ago. You barely recovered. Your kids are far away. And now a difficult cat? At your age, you should be thinking about yourself, not a stray animal." Ellie tried to object, but, "Sylvia, she was everything to me." "So what? Sylvie's gone, and that cat isn't her monument. Do a good deed. Take her to a shelter where they can give her professional care. And you go to the gym, take care of yourself. You're stuck in the past." Ellie forcefully pressed the disconnect button. She felt her cheeks flush with heat. The other's sound startled Maisie. The cat flinched. All the fur on her back stood up. Her whiskers twitched sharply, pinpointing the direction of the threat. She felt a wave of hot, salty despair wash over the woman sitting in the next room. This wasn't anger, which could be bitten or chased away with a hiss. It was something more dangerous: weakness. That evening, Chloe, Ellie's daughter, called. In her voice, there was no longer just indifference, but clear irritation. "Mom, we're going to the cabin for the weekend. You need to clear your head. Come up, get some fresh air." "Chloe, I can't." Ellie pressed against the cold window pane, feeling the frosty coolness cut through the warmth of her sweater. "Maisie, I can't leave her alone. She hasn't come out at all." Chloe laughed. The sound was sharp, like cracking glass. "Are you insane? You're turning down time with your own daughter and grandkids because of a cat that hates you and sits under an armoire? This isn't funny anymore, Mom. It's pathological. Do you have some kind of psychological issue? Are you replacing her with Grandma?" "Don't do this, Chloe." Ellie felt her breath catch. "You don't understand. I gave my word." "You gave your word to a dead person over an animal," Chloe cried out, her voice now vibrating with offense and anger. "Does family mean nothing to you now?" A physical sensation of betrayal squeezed Ellie's throat. A heavy, acrid lump rose from her stomach to her esophagus. She struggled to push out the words, which sounded clipped, flat. "Please, let's end this conversation. I can't." She ended the call without waiting for an answer. The phone dropped onto the sofa, and the woman felt her entire body, down to the last muscle, fill with an exhausting, aching heaviness. It wasn't just distress. It was absolute solitude. No one, not a single person in her circle, understood her impulse, her sense of duty, her desire to preserve a tiny piece of Sylvia. Everyone saw only a problem, not a memory. She stood up and went into the hall. She slowly lowered herself to the floor, crossing her legs. Her head slumped. She didn't say a word, only leaned her forehead against the rough, dusty wall next to the armoire. She felt the dust particles tickle her skin. For the first time in days, she didn't try to feed the cat, didn't try to comfort her. She just sat, motionless and quiet. Maisie sensed a sharp change in the other's aura. Now the woman didn't smell like intrusive perfume, but like pure grief. The scent was familiar. It was her scent when she cried after a fight with her sister. Maisie curled up into a tight ball but didn't hiss. She was unused to seeing this huge figure so small, so hunched, so alone. The cat didn't understand what a shelter, a fixed income, or pathology were. She only understood one thing: pain. The pain that had filled this apartment after her disappearance. And this pain was now radiating from the other. Ellie lifted her head, her eyes dry. She wasn't going to cry. The tears were gone. She looked at the thin gap under the armoire. "I understand. You hurt. And I hurt. And nobody understands." She stood up again. The decision to call the shelter, which she had almost made, suddenly felt like a betrayal, not just of Sylvia's memory, but of herself. To give Maisie away meant admitting that she and her pain and her loneliness were useless to anyone. No one would understand. And since no one would understand, there was no point even trying to seek support. They had to walk this path together, like two outcasts. 2 weeks. After 14 days, the other's most alarming foreign scent ceased to be sharp. It didn't vanish, but it became subtle, almost part of the background. Now it didn't pierce. It layered onto the other apartment smells, creating a strange two-layered world. Maisie no longer sensed sharp traces of fear or irritation. Now a faint, warm, almost neutral scent hung in the air. Old books, instant coffee, and a warm wool blanket. It was the scent of quiet exhaustion. For the first time in a long time, Maisie dared to change positions. She slowly crawled out from under the armoire, only halfway, so she could dart back in. Her belly touched the cold, smooth parquet floor. It smelled of cool wood and a faint polish. She inhaled in the corner where her bowl stood. It no longer smelled of the tuna she had ignored, but of ordinary, dry, boring kibble that the other changed every day. It was unappetizing, but bearable. Ellie exhaled, barely noticing the tiny change. She made no sound, no sudden movement. Maisie had crawled out for the first time in 2 weeks. "Well, there you go," Ellie whispered, sitting at the table. "You finally decided you won't sweat from fear." The cat, alert, froze. Her front paws trembled slightly on the floor. Every movement Ellie made was now slow, deliberate, as if she were moving underwater. She tried not to look directly at the cat, giving her the false confidence of invisibility. Their life became like the cohabitation of two ghosts. Maisie lived in the hall and the kitchen. Ellie lived in the living room. They exchanged space without intersecting. At night, while Ellie slept, Maisie made her necessary excursions. She regularly drank water, and under the cover of darkness, she nibbled at the dry food, just enough to survive. Ellie found traces of her nocturnal existence, a slightly shifted bowl, a strand of fur on the rug she constantly cleaned. One Saturday morning, Ellie was sitting and sorting through old photo albums. Sylvia always kept them in a shoebox. Ellie came across a photo taken 3 years ago at the cabin. Sylvia sat on a bench, bright summer light falling on her hair, and on her shoulder, like a fur collar, lay Maisie. The cat in the picture was different, relaxed, confident, full of trust. Ellie felt her throat tighten, not from tears, but from the realization of the depth of the loss. Maisie had lost more than food and shelter. She had lost her anchor. That evening, Ellie called Chloe. The dialogue was necessary. "Chloe, how are you?" Ellie's voice was soft, but not submissive. "Fine," her daughter replied. "We were thinking, you haven't given her away yet?" "No, I can't. And you know what I realized?" Ellie took a deep breath. "Sylvie and I hadn't seen each other for a week before she died, but this cat was with her every day. She heard her breathing, felt her warmth. She lost everything." Chloe, apparently not expecting such a sharp, personal monologue, swallowed. "Mom, that's just sentimental. You're comparing yourself to a cat." "I'm comparing grief," Ellie said firmly. "I'm grieving for a friend I lost. And she's grieving for her person, her entire universe. And, you know, I'm not so lonely anymore. At least I understand what she feels. I see my own pain in her. We're two ghosts under one roof who lost the same thing." Chloe was silent, then swallowed again and replied, "Mom, you're talking strangely, as if she isn't just a cat." "She isn't just a cat," Ellie almost whispered, glancing at the shadow under the armoire. Ellie hung up, feeling her temples pulse with tension. She closed her eyes and pressed her wrist to her cold forehead. Something had shifted inside her. Until this moment, she had seen Maisie as a problem, a living obligation imposed by death. Now she saw herself in her, clumsy, closed off, bristling at any attempt to invade her personal space, just as she herself had barricaded herself in her small world after her husband died, putting up a shield of exhaustion and indifference to life. She stood up and, without turning on the light, headed to the kitchen. In the darkness, she could barely see the bowl of dry food that Maisie hadn't touched for 2 days. And then she smelled a sharp, acrid odor. Maisie, cornered, couldn't hold on any longer. Obviously, she felt sick. Without leaving her refuge, she had done it right there, under the armoire, violating all rules of cleanliness. Ellie felt a punch to the gut. Disgust mixed with a sudden sharp rush of pity that was almost physical pain. The cat wasn't just being difficult. She was suffering. That smell was a cry for help, a last resort of resistance. Ellie slowly squatted down. She saw 2 narrow eyes gleam in the darkness. Maisie was waiting for punishment, hissing a swat, but Ellie did nothing. She only extended her palm and, without touching the animal, gently wiggled her fingers in front of the gap. "It's okay, girl." Her tone was completely even and devoid of any falseness. "I'll clean it up. You're just very scared. We're both scared." Ellie brought a rag and a bucket filled with warm water. The water, mixed with the light scent of cleaner, cut through the acrid smell of despair. Working in the narrow space, Ellie noticed a tiny, strange detail. On the very edge of the dusty, dark baseboard, an old yellowed piece of paper was taped. It was a tiny note from Sylvia, written in her characteristic rounded handwriting with a heavy press. The inscription read, "M loves gentle scratches behind her right ear, only gentle." This small, forgotten note, intended perhaps for neighbors or whoever watched the cat, brought Sylvia back into the room for a moment. It wasn't just a message, it was an intimate act of trust, directed from the past. It was proof of how vital this cat was to Sylvia. Ellie gently peeled off the paper and hid it in her pocket. She remembered that Sylvia's sister, Audrey, would soon be visiting to pick up the remaining valuable items, and that meeting, in light of the found note, took on a completely new protective meaning. The memory washed over her, not as a smell or a sound, but as a feeling, the same devastating yet comforting isolation she had felt looking at Maisie. 3 years ago, a year after her husband's death, she returned to their empty home. She remembered standing in the living room. Her arms hung by her sides. She felt as though she had encased herself in a thick, impenetrable shell of indifference. Friends called, her daughter visited, but she couldn't let them inside her grief. Any display of sympathy seemed painful, intrusive, and even offensive interference. She pushed love away because the pain of the loss was too sharp. She felt safer being alone, closed off, invulnerable. She thought it was better to be a stone than a vulnerable person. That was exactly why she was sitting on the floor now, and not on the sofa. After the failure of the abrupt movement, when the cat reacted with frightened rejection, Ellie wrapped her wrist with a simple gauze bandage. She sat, leaning against the wall. Quietly, silently, she engaged in the meditative process of sorting through old embroidery floss, preparing perhaps to start stitching something meaningless. Maisie watched her. Since the incident with the sudden movement, the cat had changed tactics. She stopped hiding under the armoire, preferring Sylvia's small rug by the window. The rug was about 6 feet away from Ellie. Now, Maisie didn't run away when Ellie entered the room, but her tail lay flat, and her ears were slightly lowered. The cat sensed that the other was no longer trying to impose her will, wasn't seeking contact, wasn't offering treats. Ellie was simply there, present like furniture, like a warm, motionless, non-aggressive object. Maisie felt she could control the distance. Today, for the first time in all these weeks, Maisie took a slow, deliberate step. She approached the tip of Ellie's bare foot. Her nose cautiously inhaled the scent. It was neutral, domestic, with a hint of chamomile from the hand cream Ellie used. Maisie wasn't seeking affection. She was conducting a reconnaissance. Ellie felt the thinnest touch of fur on her skin. It was so fleeting and unexpected that she barely restrained herself from a sharp intake of breath. It was not a strike, nor a hiss, nor aggression. It was a test. Ellie remained motionless. Her breathing slowed and became practically soundless. She didn't look at the cat, continuing to sort the threads. Maisie, satisfied that there was no reaction, allowed herself more. She gently, almost shyly, rubbed her side against Ellie's ankle. It was a short, dry touch that lasted no more than 2 seconds. For the cat, it was a massive step, an act of almost complete trust on her terms. Ellie felt a hot, dense rush of warmth and moisture in her eyes, but held it back. She couldn't allow herself to cry, couldn't allow herself to move. If she moved now, it would break the spell. And then she remembered the note. M loves gentle scratches behind her right ear, only gentle. Ellie slowly, as if in slow motion, lifted her right hand, the same hand that now moved not toward the cat, but off to the side, toward the wall. Maisie, catching the movement in her peripheral vision, froze, ready to bolt, but the hand stopped. It hovered in the air. Ellie very slowly, literally by 2 millimeters, flexed her index finger and brought it toward the cat. Not from above, not from the side of the muzzle, but from below, almost under the chin, imitating the shape of a cat's paw as much as possible. Maisie felt the tremor in the air caused by the finger's movement. She didn't jump away. She waited, her pupils narrowed to thin slits. And then that finger, the tip of which was warm and soft, barely touched the fur behind her right ear. It didn't stroke, it just paused. Ellie felt the thick, silky fur and the firm, springy cartilage of the ear under her finger. The tension was almost unbearable. A second, 2, and then Maisie made her reciprocal step. She didn't pull back. She leaned forward a few millimeters, pressing her ear into the finger. Ellie felt the fine muscles under her finger relax. It was a breakthrough that was worth all her 2 months of patience. "We're both stones," Ellie whispered, finally breaking the silence, but her voice was hoarse and soft. "It's easier for both of us to hide." She saw herself in this cat. Maisie was a mirror of her own isolation after her husband's passing. The cat demanded a full guarantee of safety before taking even one step toward trust. Just as Ellie had demanded from the world a guarantee of no new pain. Both of them were wounded, both were scared to the bone, and both were afraid that the next person they trusted would suddenly disappear. Ellie cautiously, with incredible tenderness, scratched the cat behind the ear with the tip of her nail. Exactly as Sylvia had written in the note. It was knowledge passed through death, an act of deep friendship. Maisie sighed. The sigh was audible to Ellie as the loudest sound in the entire apartment. The cat closed her eyes, her whiskers twitched with pleasure, and she finally relaxed her ankle. Ellie felt her chest swell with a feeling akin to love. It wasn't love for the cat, but love for herself, for that part of her soul that had found the strength to trust and care again. By saving Maisie, she had begun to save herself from her own stony shell. An unexpected event occurred at the start of a new day. Ellie, returning from the grocery store, was carrying a large angular bag with a sack of cat litter. The bag smelled sharply of street-dampened cardboard and exhaust fumes from passing cars, smells that had nothing to do with the comfort of their apartment. Maisie was waiting. For the last few days, after Ellie's fingertip scratch behind her ear, the cat had ventured out of the kitchen. Now she spent time on the sunny but cool windowsill in the living room. The cat felt she was in control of the situation, deciding when to approach and when to pull back. But that sudden loud rustle of the bag by the door, which Ellie placed on the floor, shattered the fragile balance. It wasn't the other's scent, nor her quiet shadow. It was the aggression of the outside world, intruding into the safe haven. The cat froze. Her eyes, usually warm and amber, darkened in the sunbeams. Her pupils instantly dilated, swallowing the light. The bag seemed to shift. It was only unstable, but in the cat's brain, this movement was interpreted as a threat. Maisie let out a dry, sharp sound that was neither a hiss nor a meow, but a low, guttural growl, the sound of pure animal panic. She arched her back, not in a bow of fear, but in a tight string of rage, ready to defend her territory. She lunged at the bag, sinking her front paws into it and trying to rip it to shreds, releasing nervous tension. "What in the world are you doing?" A scream tore from Ellie's lips. She was exhausted. The endless days of walking cautiously, the constant control over her body, the fear of making the wrong move. Now, all of it collapsed because of a piece of cardboard. The anger she had held in check for so long erupted. Her voice was loud, uncontrolled, soaring to a high-pitched shriek. "Stop it! Stop that! Right now!" The scream was a physical blow. Something snapped inside Maisie. The other's voice, the one she was used to hearing, quiet, hoarse, full of cautious pleading, suddenly became a sound of danger, as piercing as a street siren. It didn't just scare her, it betrayed her. All her tiny steps toward trust, all the permitted touches, now seemed like a trap. The cat stopped. The fur on her hackles stood up, and her ear shells were pressed so tightly to her head they seemed part of her skull. She didn't run. She froze in pure, paralyzing terror. Ellie felt her face flush with shame before she even fully realized what she had done. She had yelled at a cornered animal. Maisie bolted with blinding speed. She didn't run to the cozy kitchen, but flew into the utility closet, which Ellie rarely entered. She buried herself under a pile of old coats, where it smelled of dust and dry lavender, and turned to stone. Ellie sat on the floor, resting her wrist against the cold doorframe, trying to cool the blood boiling in her veins. She stared at the claw marks on the bag and felt the fine muscles in her legs tense with helplessness. The phone rang. Chloe's name flashed on the screen. Ellie picked up the receiver. Her tone was lifeless. "Yeah, Chloe. Are you home? You sound a little winded." "Yeah, I'm fine. Just dropped a bag." "Listen, Mom, are you absolutely sure?" Chloe swallowed before continuing. "I talked to the girls at the rescue where you can surrender her. They said they have programs for feral animals where they adapt them first and then look for new owners. You did everything you could. And at your age, do you really need this trouble?" Ellie listened, and her daughter's words layered over the cat's voice echoing in her head. "Traitor!" Suddenly, her own resentment and shame merged into a furious, burning cocktail. "Trouble?" Ellie's voice exploded, soaring to a pitch she hadn't heard from herself in years. What are you even talking about? You call me just to ask about the feral animal. Have you once asked how I feel, how I live alone within these four walls?" Chloe stumbled on the other end of the line. A dead silence fell. "Mom, I don't understand what's wrong with you." "And I do understand. You set up your life, you moved away, you live there with your kids. And me? What am I supposed to do here, Chloe? My only friend died. I'm trying to do just one right thing, not let an animal die of fear, and you call me and suggest throwing her out. What next?" Ellie gripped her temples, feeling them pulse with tension. "What if I give her away? What will be left? Just the ceiling and four walls? Do you want me to die here of loneliness because that's how you took care of me?" "Mom, that's not fair. No, it is fair." Ellie struck the doorframe with her palm. "I'm telling you straight now. Either you support me, or you stop calling altogether. I am not giving up Maisie, and I won't let you deprive me of the last reason I have to get out of bed in the morning. Did you hear me?" Chloe was silent. Finally, her voice was hoarse. "I heard you." Ellie hung up the phone. The shame that had been squeezing her chest slowly began to recede, replaced by cold, clear determination. She had been on the edge, but hadn't crossed it. Ellie stood up. She took the food bowl, walked over to the closet door, and ignoring the smell of mothballs that seeped through the gap, placed the bowl on the floor. "I'm here," she said quietly, but her voice was clear and steady. "And I won't leave. Eat, Maisie. I'll wait until you trust me again." Ellie's internal state was worse than after the argument with Sylvia's sister. Then it was anger, now it was bitter shame. Ellie's inner voice whispered that she was no better than her daughter when she had yelled. She had broken down. She had used the animal's despair and the memory of her friend to deflect Chloe's attack. And most importantly, she had betrayed Maisie. The scream was the final nail hammering shut the utility closet door. Ellie felt a heaviness in her body, as if gravity had suddenly intensified. Her elbows rested heavily on the kitchen table and her feet refused to lift. She couldn't bring herself to go to the closet to check the bowl. She knew it was empty. She spent almost the entire day in this stupor. Closer to evening, she felt physically ill from the smell of her own weakness and the dust in the house. She needed to get out, not for shopping, but just to breathe out this heaviness. Ellie went outside. The lights in the old downtown district were already lit. Their light flickered in the damp air. The scent of ozone and cold moisture rose from the asphalt. She walked, hands deep in her jacket pockets, hunched over as if carrying an invisible weight. She turned into the narrow alley that led to the old bakery. It was there that she ran into Nina. Nina was a former colleague of Sylvia's from the preschool, a woman in her 50s with a short, graying haircut and a very calm, deep gaze. "Lena!" Nina stopped, blinking in surprise. "Good heavens, it's been years. I didn't recognize you right away." "Nina, hello?" Ellie said, trying to make her tone polite, but her voice sounded clipped. "How are you? I was at the funeral, but I didn't get a chance to approach you. It was such a crowd." They fell silent. The silence was broken only by the creak of an old gate from a neighboring yard and the distant hum of traffic. I took Maisie," Ellie said. The words tumbled out. It was a confession. Nina's face softened. "You wonderful person. I knew someone had to do it." "I'm not wonderful." Ellie picked at the edges of her jacket pocket. "I can't cope. She hates me. She sits in the closet. She's afraid of me. I yelled at her yesterday, and my daughter is demanding I give her away." I'm starting to doubt myself." Nina looked at her intently. There was no judgment or pity in her eyes, only understanding. "Sylvie was always a loner," Nina began. "You were her only true friend. Lena, but even you only knew part of her life. She never trusted men or her family. More importantly, she always said. Nina tilted her head slightly, as if listening to long-ago spoken words. "We were sitting in the staff room once, drinking tea. She was looking at a photo of Maisie she carried everywhere. And Sylvie told me, 'Nina, I know I'm nobody's first choice except this damn cat. If anything happens to me, she'll be the only one who remembers me.'" These words didn't just strike Ellie. They pierced her from her throat to her diaphragm. She felt her insides twist into a tight knot. It was a physical reaction to the suddenly revealed truth. Sylvia hadn't left her a burden or a problem. She had left her a last wish, not on paper, but from the heart. The last living anchor of her memory. "She said that knowing she was dying?" Ellie asked, her voice sounding firm, casting off all doubt. "She always talked like something would happen sooner or later. Her heart, you know. She was just afraid Maisie would be homeless. Sylvie didn't want Maisie to be betrayed a second time." Ellie lifted her shoulders, feeling a huge weight fall away. This wasn't just a justification for her efforts, it was a command. To give up Maisie meant betraying not only a living, frightened creature, but her closest friend, who had foreseen her own fate. "Thank you, Nina," Ellie said. She wasn't smiling, but her gaze was clear. "I understand." "You're welcome, Lena. You'll manage, both of you." Nina smiled warmly and walked on. Ellie turned around. The fatigue that had been pressing on her body was gone. She was no longer a helpless woman tormented by a stubborn animal. She was the keeper of a final wish, the protector of a memory, and the only hope of a living creature. She walked home. At home, the air smelled of dust and lavender from the closet, cut by the faint, acrid scent of untouched food. Ellie approached the closet. She didn't speak. She didn't yell. She simply sat down next to it, leaning her back against the cold wall, and closed her eyes. From this moment on, she was changing tactics. She would not ask for trust. She would earn it with her calm, motionless strength. A new, almost monastic silence settled in the apartment. Several more weeks passed, and Ellie no longer tried to catch Maisie's gaze, persuade her, or tempt her with treats. She became part of the furniture, motionless, warm, predictable. She didn't need to prove her love to Maisie. She needed to prove her constancy. Outside the window, autumn had given way to the first gray days of winter. The light in the apartment was diffused, soft. The rustle of the pages of the book Ellie was reading and the steady ticking of the wall clock layered onto the background, creating a soothing rhythm. Maisie came out of the closet 3 days after Ellie's outburst. She didn't do it triumphantly. She simply slipped out of the shadow like an old, forgotten rag and froze under the kitchen table. She wasn't hiding, but she wasn't approaching either. The days only differed by the numbers on the calendar. Day 100, day 105, day 110. Ellie sat on the sofa in the living room. Her feet were covered by a knitted throw, and her hands were busy. She was unraveling an old wool scarf to reknit it into a new one. Her wrist movements were slow, even, and completely non-aggressive. Maisie watched. The fear that had once compressed her into a stone ball had turned into a dry, background tension. She had studied the other's biorhythms. She knew when Ellie would stand up, when she would go to the front door for the mail, and when she would return to the sofa. She understood that this woman, though capable of a loud and frightening sound, always returned, and always sat in the same place, like an old armoire or a floor lamp. She was motionless. She was predictable. This was a language Maisie understood. On this day, Maisie was within arm's reach. She lay on the edge of the rug, sprawled out to maximize contact with the warm pile. Her breathing was even, and her eyes were only half closed. Ellie noticed the thin stream of air the cat exhaled. She lowered the scarf to her lap. "You know," Ellie said calmly. The tone was level and quiet, like the rustling of water. "I realized you were Sylvie's anchor, and now you're mine." Maisie twitched her whiskers. She heard the words, but no threat. It was simply the vocal accompaniment to the silence. At that moment, the aroma of something fresh and green entered the room. On the kitchen windowsill, there was a pot of mint that Ellie sometimes touched. The cat slowly twitched her nose. This smell was new, clean. It cut through the usual aroma of book dust and old wallpaper. And then Maisie made her choice. It wasn't a flight, nor a leap. It was a deliberate movement. She pushed off with her hind legs, a short, confident push. She glided across the rug and, jumping up, landed right on the sofa near Ellie's feet. Ellie froze. Her knees remained motionless. She didn't cry out. She didn't flinch. She was the motionless tree that Maisie had studied. The cat immediately got to business. She rose onto her front paws, stretched thoroughly as if doing an exercise, and then, overcoming the last, thinnest strand of fear, pressed her forehead against Ellie's shin. It was an incredible touch. Ellie felt a thin but powerful vibration pierce her skin. It was a purr. Not loud, but physically palpable, it passed through the thickness of the throw like an electric current and resonated somewhere in Ellie's chest. Tears that hadn't flowed when she buried her friend, and which she had held back when she screamed at her daughter, burned her eyes. This was not just a cat, it was a living, vibrating response to her patience. It was recognition. Maisie settled into a tight ball right on the edge of the throw next to Ellie's calf muscle, and her body felt heavy, like a warm stone. "You're mine," Ellie mouthed soundlessly, feeling a single hot tear run down her cheek. She slowly, gently, as if touching fragile antique china, lowered her hand and touched the fur on Maisie's back. It wasn't a tentative gesture, but a long, confident stroke. The cat didn't flinch, she only deepened her purr. They were both learning to trust again. Ellie realized she hadn't saved the cat. It was Sylvia, by leaving Maisie, who had saved her from herself, returning to her the ability to feel. Suddenly, a sharp, insistent knock sounded at the door. The rhythm of the purr faltered, and Maisie lifted her head. Her nostrils quivered. Ellie felt the peaceful scene instantly tense up, anticipating the intrusion. The knock repeated, sharp and impatient. Ellie felt the muscles in her back instantly tighten, shedding the warmth she had just gained. Maisie, who a second ago was pouring out her quiet gratitude, had already slipped off the sofa and concealed herself under the armchair. Ellie sighed heavily. She knew that knock. Only Mrs. Peterson, the neighbor from the first floor, knocked like she was delivering the good news of the end of the world. Ellie opened the door. Standing on the threshold was a woman in her mid-60s in her perpetual gray cardigan. Her drawn face expressed a mixture of concern and righteous condemnation. "Eleanor Hayes," Mrs. Peterson's voice was high and vibrating, "you simply won't believe. You just won't believe what I was told." Ellie compressed her lips. She knew what she had been told. Rumors about her friend's mysterious cat, which she had locked in the apartment, had likely already circulated through the entire building. "What were you told, Mrs. Peterson?" Ellie said evenly, clipped, not allowing the neighbor to take the dominant position. "That you're keeping a stray cat for weeks in your apartment. It's unsanitary." The neighbor wrung her thin fingers. "Understand, I'm worried about your well-being, at your age. Why do you need these problems?" Ellie felt the warmth gifted by the purr replaced by a cold, burning irritation in her collarbones. She was ready for this conversation. Unlike her breakdown earlier, now she felt firmness, not despair. "The cat is not a stray. She was the pet of my friend Sylvia, and now she lives with me." Ellie put emphasis on the "with me." "She's perfectly fine. The smell you're talking about is likely just a smell." "It's not just a smell," Mrs. Peterson interrupted, craning her neck. "People see you're exhausted. You're fussing over her like a baby. What will people say about your situation when you need to be thinking about yourself, not a strange creature? You need to be thinking about your daughter and your grandkids, and you—" "Mrs. Peterson." Ellie took a step forward, and the neighbor instinctively stepped back half a pace. "You've expressed your concern for me. Thank you. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm closing the door." Ellie, neatly but firmly, closed the door right in the neighbor's face. Her heart was beating fast, not from fear, but from an unaccustomed, intoxicating victory. For the first time in a long time, she had met external condemnation head-on, and hadn't bent. She only returned to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water when the phone rang. Chloe's name lit up the screen. "Mom? Hi," Chloe began with a guilt-ridden, insistent tone. "I was thinking you were probably right about me that day. I'm sorry, but—" She paused briefly. "Did you give the cat away yet?" Ellie picked up the phone. Her wrists weren't trembling, her fingers calmly gripped the glass. "You called to find that out?" Ellie asked directly, without mincing words. "And to check on you, too," Chloe hastily added. "It's just that Sylvia's neighbors mentioned that well, you don't look good. I'm worried, Mom. All this fuss at your age. You know, it's better to give her to a shelter where they can really help her. And you live for yourself." "Live for myself," Ellie laughed. The laugh was dry, short, like a snap. "Chloe, you moved away 3 years ago. You live in a big city with your family and are completely preoccupied with yourself. And that's fine. But when you tell me to live for myself, you mean look at the ceiling and wait for old age. And when you say give up the cat, you mean return to the loneliness that is convenient for me so that you don't worry." Ellie felt her throat tighten and her back straightened like a rod. "Your son?" Ellie continued. Her voice was even, steely. "He calls me once a week. You call when you need something. I'm not complaining, but you don't get to tell me how to manage my heart and my loneliness. It's a cat." Ellie glanced at the armchair where Maisie's silhouette could be guessed in the shadow. "This cat needs me more than all of you because, unlike you, she doesn't make me prove that I'm still alive." A dense, shocked silence hung on the other end of the line. Chloe swallowed. "Mom, you're being so harsh." "Yes, harsh," Ellie confirmed. "Now listen, I'll manage her. And you either support my decision or we just won't talk about Maisie. But I'm not giving her away. She's mine, my inheritance." Chloe, flustered, quickly said goodbye, and the connection was broken. Ellie put down the phone, feeling the pulsing in her temples. She was emotionally drained but free. Some invisible, suffocating ring that had encircled her for years finally cracked. Maisie slowly crawled out from under the armchair. She looked at Ellie with her narrowed eyes. "Well, that's that," Ellie whispered, sinking onto the sofa. Maisie sighed, a heavy, full-body sigh. Then she walked to Ellie's feet, felt the warmth of the throw, and jumped up. This time there were no tests, no checking. She simply lay down, completely relaxed, curling into a warm ball on her owner's lap. It was her final, quiet yes. This moment was the turning point. Now they were together. 4 months later. This was already a completely different apartment, and more importantly, it was a completely different Ellie. Before, the apartment had been a museum of sorrow, clean but cold, filled with a passive silence where only dry echoes could be heard. Morning light, penetrating the sheer curtains, only highlighted the dust of loneliness. Now, life had moved into the apartment. A light, fluffy rug lay on the floor, bought specifically so Maisie could stretch out at full length near the radiator. There were new, soft pillows on the sofa that the cat occasionally kneaded with her paws before curling up. The silence became active. It was filled with the click of claws on the parquet, a quiet, confident purr that vibrated even in the walls, and Ellie's voice, who now didn't just mutter, but talked to the cat, sharing her plans for the day. Morning didn't begin with cold numbness in front of the coffee maker, but with a warm, furry invasion. Maisie slept exclusively on Ellie's pillow. At this moment, as the first rays of the winter sun slid across the windowsill, Ellie opened her eyes and found a heavy, relaxed weight on her chest. The cat was lying there, completely uninhibited, offering her throat for a caressing hand. Ellie laughed. The sound was clean, light, nothing like the dry, nervous laugh Chloe had heard. She cautiously stroked Maisie between the ears. "Well, my little inheritance," Ellie whispered. "Time to rejoin the world." Ellie noticed how much she had started doing again. She was cooking, sometimes even humming. She was reading new books, not just flipping through old albums. She signed up for a pottery class. Loneliness hadn't disappeared, but it had ceased to be an affliction. Now it was a comfortable emptiness that she could fill as she wished. Maisie had become her ritual and her anchor. When Ellie returned from classes or the grocery store, as soon as the key turned in the lock, she would hear a light thud. The cat was already sitting on the threshold, greeting her. Maisie no longer hid. She was the lady of the house. Her eyes, once full of wild, hunted fear, now expressed calm possession and gentle demandingness. It was taking care of Maisie that forced Ellie to stop worrying about what people would say about her. She understood that in their small world, with the cat on her lap, she was her own authority. Maisie taught Ellie to feel. Caring for a defenseless creature who had been through the same trauma as herself, the loss of a loved one, thawed her own heart, which had been frozen since her husband's death. That evening, Ellie sat in the living room. Maisie, having finished her evening meal, lay on the sofa, stretching her paws and exposing her belly to the gentle lamplight. Ellie walked to the bookshelf, on the top shelf of which stood the only photograph of Sylvia, her friend, smiling broadly in the summer sun. Ellie took the photograph in her hands. In it, Sylvia was holding a very small, black, clumsy Maisie. There was so much light, so much devotion in her friend's smile. Ellie sat down on the edge of the sofa, looking at the photo. Her voice was quiet, calm, devoid of the former bitterness. "Sylvie, you're probably laughing now?" Ellie began, tracing her finger over the familiar old face. "I was so scared then. Scared of losing you, scared of this cat, scared that I couldn't handle the grief for her. All they saw was an old woman and an extra burden." Ellie looked down at Maisie, who lazily opened one golden eye in response. "But you were smarter than everyone, Sylvie." You didn't leave me a burden. You left me a mirror. She forced me to see how I was hiding, and she forced me to reach out again. You know, I saved her, yes, from your indifferent family. But, Ellie pressed the photo to her chest, by saving her, I saved myself. I learned to feel again, learned to love again. Maisie yawned sweetly. She sensed the warmth of the photograph and moved closer to Ellie. She snuck under the arm that Ellie used to hold the picture and rested her head on her thigh.